from the Department of Rhetoric, who will talk about Trump, what does the name signify. Then Paul Lawrie from the History Department will talk about the historical context. And thirdly, we will then hear from Jenny Wills from the English Department, who will talk about Trump, Asian Americans, and storytelling. So first of all, Matthew, take it away.
Thank you, Professor Mill and Ray Silvius for organizing this. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see such a large crowd here today. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay. So I wanted to start actually by reading a quote. This is from Stuart Hall. And the quote is this: "No one seriously concerned with political strategies in the current situation can now afford to ignore the swing to the right. We may not yet understand its extent and its limits, its specific character, its causes and effects. We have so far, with one or two notable exceptions, failed to find strategies capable of mobilizing social forces strong enough in depth to turn its flank, but the tendency is hard to deny. It no longer looks like a temporary swing in the political fortunes, a short-term shift in the balance of forces." This is Stuart Hall writing in 1979 about the rise of Thatcherism. And we're talking today about Trumpism as a political phenomenon, but also as a cultural phenomenon. And I think that there is a significant difference between talking about Thatcherism with the rise of neoliberalism in the late 70s, early 80s, towards the 90s. Two very famous statements from Thatcher. One, the idea society doesn't exist, there are only individuals and families. That's a paraphrase, I know the exact quote is somewhat different. And then the idea that there is no alternative. And these are ideas contained in what the now late scholar Mark Fisher referred to as capitalist realism, a term that he uses to talk about how we're at a point now where we understand the world primarily in terms of capitalism as the only form that exists today, that we cannot think of any alternatives, as Thatcher puts it. And what I want to talk about in terms of Trumpism are some of the contradictions. Some of the contradictions that I think can help us to understand the phenomenon, the ideology today. So for me, the name Trump signifies or represents a new historical period based on these three overlapping contradictions, and these are by no means extensive, but there are three that I want to talk about today. The first is the idea of subversion in postmodern culture. The second has to do with the contradiction between the democratic and the commercial logics of the media. And then the last one has to do with speaking from a left perspective, thinking about the failure of the left in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. So I'll begin with the first contradiction, the one on subversion in postmodern culture. And to explain this, I'm going to have to do a little bit of theoretical context here. To explain this, understand subversion in modern culture. So if we think about modernism, there's a very famous quote, not necessarily famous, but there's a quote from the historian Harry Anderson that goes, "Modernism from its earliest in its origins in Baudelaire and Flisfeder onwards virtually defined itself as being anti-bourgeois. Postmodernism is what happens when, without any victory, that adversary is gone." So one way to understand modern culture has to do with its drive towards subversion. We think about it, for instance, in art and culture, subversion of formal style, subversion of things like realism in the new forms of impressionism, expressionism, surrealism, and so forth. But also constant push towards subverting new forms of mass culture. New forms of mass culture. One way to understand the drive in modernism is its constant push against the commodifying things we're getting too packed with. Push against the commodifying processes of commercial culture in mass culture. But one way to understand then the subsequent postmodern culture is what happens when subversion of authority in modernism itself in a way becomes something like the dominant ideology. So we see this, for instance, when we have the canonization of modern art and culture in universities, in the galleries, but even in the form of the integration of modernism into mass culture, and the commodification of culture more generally. exemplified, for instance, in the image of Andy Warhol's soup can, where advertising becomes art and art becomes advertising and so forth. So for me, the question then, when subversion starts to look like the dominant ideology, how do you subvert subversion? And I can think also the way that the commodification of subversion works, for instance, in something like subculture. So there's the classic cultural studies text, Dick Habdidge's study on subculture. One of the clearest ways to diffuse the potential threat of subculture is through its incorporation into the mainstream mass culture. And this is something that I see happening in the context of a postmodern culture. So when subversion, and we see this drive towards creativity in the commercial culture, that's one of the moving thrusts of capitalist society. The question then is, how do you subvert what is already perceived as subversive? I think in some ways the rise of something like politically correct language or identity politics has been assumed to be this raising of subversion into the dominant ideology. And for many on the right end of the spectrum, identity politics, politically correct language has appeared to become what's now thought of as a dominant ideology. So how do you subvert subversion? Well, it's by criticizing what's perceived as politically correct language or identity politics. And a good way to understand this is through the example of David Fincher's Fight Club. People know the film Fight Club. So one of the things I find interesting about Fight Club is that on the surface of things, it appears to be rather subversive. It appears to be a text that is about anti-consumerism, but that's couched in a subtext of blatant misogyny. And you can see this throughout the film, that there's this, constant attention to, the way to fight consumerism is by becoming more masculine. There's a sense that consumerism is something that feminizes us. The way to reclaim our strength is by becoming stronger and stronger men. In a way, that emphasis on the masculinism of the film uses culture to displace the political centrality of the class conflict. So in a way, you have this problem of culture war trumping class war. So that's one way I think about the problem, the contradiction of subversion in a postmodern culture. The second contradiction I want to talk about is the one between the democratic and the commercial aspects of mainstream mass media. So one of my all-time favorite films is Robert Zemeckis' Back to the Future, and there's that great line in the middle of Back to the Future when Doc Brown says to Marty, "No wonder your president," he's speaking of Ronald Reagan, "no wonder your president has to be an actor, he has to look good on television." So I think this was kind of this moment of recognizing that much of the political spectrum from the 80s onward, even from the Kennedy-Nixon period onward, relies on some kind of personality that's going to get through to the public through the mainstream mass media. And even recently, CNN pundit Van Jones has said that Donald Trump is the first example of a social media or reality TV president. What I think is contradictory in the media is that on the one hand, there's an important democratic function played by the media. The important democratic function of the media is information. That if you're living in a democratic society, we require a media that's going to provide us with information that we need in order to act as democratic citizens in a democratic world, right? So that's kind of, the civics lesson we all get about the media. This is the purpose that it serves. It's an informational purpose. But in capitalist societies, the private mainstream mass media is also driven by its profit motive. And anybody who's familiar with political economic critique of the media knows that one of the things that drives the filtration of information, not direct censorship, but thinking about the classic Chomsky and Herman analysis of the media, the propaganda model, that information will get filtered out if it harms in some way the profit incentive, the profit motive of the mainstream mass media. So how does the media deal with this issue of being informational, but also geared towards its profit motive? So I think that the spectacularization of a figure like Donald Trump is something that we get, right? That because he's a constant stream of information, not just of information, but also spectacle that attracts audiences, there's much more incentive to put his image up rather than others. Right? So there's that element of Trumpism that I think is worth talking about. The other is today with the problem of the way in which we gather information through digital culture and social media in particular, primarily corporate social media, which is also like mainstream mass media driven by profit motive. And we know that through different mechanisms, software and algorithmic logic, that there's a tendency for us to enter into these spaces of the informational echo chamber, or the informational silo, where much of the information that we're getting is really the preaching to the choir or preaching to the converted type of situation. And this has sort of sparked this problem that we've heard a lot about, this notion of rumor mills coming out post-truth, or the idea of fake news. How are we supposed to deal with this situation? Part of the problem as well with the issue of the echo chambers and the information silos is that for one thing on the left, many people are familiar with this, the Chomsky and Herman Chomsky propaganda critique of right-wing ideology coming in. But there's also on the right this problem of believing that there's a liberal conspiracy in the media, that the liberal media. Overall, there's become a huge distrust in the mainstream mass media on both the left and right. So this is one reason why I think we can see the emergence of these echo chambers forming. And one of the other interesting phenomena to arrive out of this is this new one of right-wing trolling online, which is, for better or worse, a form of bullying that I think we see as one of the cultural forms that's come out of this phenomenon. So the last contradiction I want to address is what I think of as a failure of the left in the moment of the financial crisis of 2008 and the rise of this new so-called alt-right. And I say so-called alt-right because in many ways I think the term is ironically politically correct one that's used to refer to new forms of emerging white nationalism, masculinism, and so forth. So a quote that I like to use, and it's Slavoj Žižek uses it, the contemporary political philosopher Slavoj Žižek uses it, referring to Walter Benjamin. I say the two because very few people are able to find the original source of the quote in Walter Benjamin. But the quote, I think, is pertinent. And it says that every rise of fascism is the result of the failure of the left. And when I say failure of the left, I don't think we're just talking about in the sense that the left doesn't have an alternative solution, alternative ideas about how to deal with the problem of something like the 2008 financial crisis, but also failure in the sense that there's competition between the center or the mainstream liberal ideology and the left perspective. And I think this is something that we saw in the conflict between a figure like Bernie Sanders and a figure like Hillary Clinton. So the failure there comes from being defeated by a liberal central ideology as well, where still within the centrist perspective, culture war and identity politics begins to trump the question of political class conflict. And this is something that I think the populist right has been able to pick up on, again in the face of the big crisis of 2008 and onwards, that there is a central problem with inequality in the political economy of capitalism. And in the face of defeat of the left, there's been a rise in new forms of pseudo-emancipatory or pseudo-subversive narratives coming out of the so-called alt-right to help people to make sense of their position in the world, what Frederick Jameson calls cognitive mapping, make sense of the world, make sense of their position in the world. That kind of speaks to that way. So this is what I think of as one of the major dangers of Trumpism. That in the face of this failure of the left to provide new forms of cognitive mapping, new narratives with which we can make sense of the situation today, that alternative pseudo-subversive, pseudo-emancipatory languages are coming out that seems to appeal to some people, of course not everyone. We know that this is the population in the US particularly split here, to help make sense of this situation. But I'll stop there for time. But then again, what do I know after all? So I'll end there. I hope that was clear.
All right, well, thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to Alan for inviting me to be part of this panel, and my fellow panelists in this just remarkable turnout, literally standing room, so obviously there's some interest, a little bit of interest in what's occurring south of the border. I'm a historian, and so I'm going to speak very briefly today. As historians, our primary task is charting change over time. So answering that proverbial question is, how have we got here? What brought us to this moment? What are the key factors that I and other historians feel have led to the rise in Trumpism? So I don't want to claim Trumpism as a historical inevitability. I certainly don't want to make any claims for its future, of what it might bring, but rather to shed some light on the historical forces that led us to this point. So first, I think we just need to very briefly consider the scale and enormity of Donald Trump's victory. This is someone who never held or ran for political office or served in the military, the two primary means through which people usually ascend to the presidency. He led a successful revolt against a Republican, a very crowded Republican establishment, and then roundly defeated a candidate who enjoyed a significant fundraising advantage, a superior ground game, and the near unanimous support of the American corporate and media establishment. And of course, here we have the electoral map of Trump's win. The map on the right, I think, is quite illustrative as well, as it marks county-by-county results. Red, of course, indicating Republican, blue, and varying shades of blue, the strength of support in this way. But Trump didn't pull off this extraordinary insurgency mainly through the force of his personality. Of course, that did have some effect. He did it by inventing a new kind of politics, a politics that we've come to deem as Trumpism. Ben Tarnoff of The Guardian said, "The triumph of Trump is the triumph of Trumpism." Try saying that like 3 times. Of course, Trumpism didn't occur in a vacuum. Many, of course, we've linked this to larger populist revolts across the world, whether it be Brexit, whether it be the rise of the nationalist right in Europe, or whether it be, of course, the insurgent campaign of Bernie Sanders in the United States, albeit from a left-wing perspective. Mass migration of capital and peoples has rocked the liberal consensus and led to a surge in these movements. Trumpism, I think we can all agree, was the right politics for the right time, a fact which Democratic operatives utterly failed to realize by running the quintessential establishment candidate at a time when tens of millions of Americans wanted to destroy the establishment. One Democratic operative was quoted as saying, "We brought a knife to a gunfight." So what then is Trumpism? We're using this term, what is Trumpism? And I had to think about that myself. And of course, I'm not offering any definitive answers, but just some ruminations on what is Trumpism. Is it conservative? Is it right-wing? Is it populist? Is it nationalist? Is it fascist? Or, as even some claim, anarchist? This is the notion that anti-statists will seize control of the state and destroy it from within, which is a very long, drawn-out plan, but nevertheless, right, one that some people are even forwarding as well. I think some of the confusion about what is Trumpism derives from the very notion of isms, right, when we use the word isms. The Oxford Dictionary defines an ism as a noun, and that it can be used informally or as derogatory. It's a distinctive practice, system, or philosophy, typically a political ideology or an artistic movement. Now, I think we can all agree that Trumpism is uniformly distinct, but it is very elusive in how we define it. Trump has proven reliably promiscuous ideologically. He's departed from Republican orthodoxy, but generally adhering to modern right-wing ideology, which of course are not mutually exclusive. For instance, while the modern Republican Party has enthusiastically embraced free trade and sponsored things such as the past President George W. Bush did, open immigration and amnesty and the like, the Trumpist consensus, of course, is completely antithetical to this. Of course, his signature, one of his signature platforms was the building of a wall on the Mexican border to stem illegal immigration from Mexico, as he claimed, while at the same time deporting millions of people already within the United States. While the modern Republican Party has advocated a robust multi, and in the case of Iraq, unilateral foreign policy, Trump speaks of wanting to preserve American blood and treasure. He wants to cease being the world's policeman, quote unquote, while at the same time, quote, bombing the hell out of ISIS. Contradictory motives. Whereas the evangelical right and the moral majority have proved a bedrock of support for the modern Republican Party, I found that this election and the Trump campaign was particularly significant for its near total lack of adherence to religious ideology, not even the pretense that the religious right would have to be courted. So in these ways, we see the contradiction from the modern Republican Party and right-wing orthodoxy, Trump having a foot in both. And the list, of course, goes on. I would very briefly, just setting up the 4 historical factors I want to talk about, I would very briefly posit seeing Trumpism not as a noun but as a verb. I would argue that it is a political or social movement that is devoid of ideology but is defined by action. Action which is primarily motivated by grievance as the motivating factor to this action. Aggrievement is the motivating impulse of Trumpism. It's a broad, diffuse, often incoherent, but fully realized and strident aggrievement on the part of tens of millions of Americans. So, I just want to hear, right, even the campaign slogan, if we look at the campaign slogan, making America great again, the again being a very key phrase here, and the power of the politics of nostalgia, right, that Trump very aggressively embraced. The notion that this was a once great nation which is imperiled and is under siege due to innumerable factors, whether they be people, whether they be places, whether they be alliances, but this allusion back to the past. So we're stuck with this conundrum. While Trumpism as a coherent political philosophy might be elusive, there are legions of Trumpists. Right? So how do we reconcile this conundrum of followers of an ideology which even its most ardent followers will claim is devoid of a solid political compass? How did this happen? As I said, Trump shares some genealogies with modern conservatism, and American history is littered with examples of populist movements which usually combine somewhat we might consider left of center railing against corporate interests, but also combined with anti-cosmopolitanism and the like. So these have always, from the early 20th century, in our region right here, just to the south of us, the populist movement of farmers that took place, of course, across borders, but in the Midwest, which led revolt against the moneyed interests of the East in the late 19th, early 20th century. We see strains of this in Trumpism, in current Trumpism. So I just want to very briefly historicize Trumpism by looking at the economic, demographics, political, and Matt's done such a fantastic job of talking about the media impulses that have been at work here. In terms of economics, I don't have time to get into all of the statistics, but I think it's quite clear to us in the wake of 2008, the shockwaves of which are still being felt in the United States today. Incomes for the richest 1% of Americans, that's those households earning $380,000 or more, have grown by 33% over the past 20 years, while the income of the other 90% of Americans has been at a standstill. You've all probably seen this recent, I just cited this as a recent sort of trying to locate Trumpism in a global context. The 8 richest people on earth, 8 of whom are Americans, now have more wealth than 50% of the world's population. Unprecedented, staggering global income inequality. Here we have income inequality in America. The red here is indicating the top 1%, which experiences a dip, as you can see at the latter part there, 2008, but is now making its way back up. And you can see the static nature of the other 99 to 90%. Real wages for middle-class families have not kept pace. The number of people in poverty rose by 2.6 million between 2011 and 2012. Recently, America has experienced some of the highest rates of poverty since the Great Depression. Most Americans, it's estimated, just under 60% will spend at least 1 year below the poverty line between the ages of 25 and 75. Astronomical forms of inequality. We can see the racial wealth divide here as well. This is taking the net assets of people, their assets measured against their debts, their household debts, and you can see the massive disparities between white Americans and then followed, of course, by Hispanics and blacks. This has raised one of the greatest questions, of course, that's infused American history, is how do you reconcile capitalism, which invariably its imperative is to generate inequality. How do you reconcile capitalism with democracy? How does the center hold in this sense, in the most direct terms? And this is at the very heart of the economic anxiety that has driven Trumpism. Many people have said, particularly those on the left, why would Americans imperiled by these forces turn to a Eastern billionaire financier as a means to solve their problems? And it's a legitimate question. There seems to be a fundamental contradiction. And I can't get into all of the aspects of that contradiction, but one way in which they do that, reconcile that, is through demographics. And just quickly before I say that, I just skipped over this one point here, and I think it's very important in terms of perception reality. This poll is taken by CNN, fake news, but CNN, just before the election. 59% of Americans, across class and racial lines, believe that the American dream, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, is now unattainable for them. And even higher numbers believe that the same is true, that it will be unattainable for their children. This is, I think, when I've just laid out the statistical basis of this, but perception as well. And we can't discount this connection between perception and reality and simply dismiss it as being delusions on the part of those same people, I said, who are entrusting their future to a man who seems to be contradictory to their interests. There's this profound notion that America is a place that has become inequitable. So demographics. Mass movement of capital leads to mass movement of peoples, and we see massive shifts, particularly in terms of rising immigration rates post-1965 in the United States, and this has led to great anxiety, labor competition, and the like on the parts of many Americans. The so-called browning of America. By 2040, by 2050 technically, but by 2040, 2050, it's estimated that America will become, and this is a tongue twister and contradictory as well, but a majority-minority country. I'll leave you to parse out the inconsistencies of that. But, majority-minority country. And this has set many Americans, particularly white Americans, of a certain economic class and across class lines, into great forms of anxiety. Of course, the embodiment of that is the first African-American president, Barack Obama, whose mere presence, independent of his political affiliations or his political actions, whose mere presence serves as a reminder of the shifting natures of power in the United States. Okay? If we break down race in the 2016 election, we can see that Trumpism has also shattered pre-existing political coalitions. The Clinton campaign was depending on mobilizing the Obama coalition of college-educated whites, women, young peoples, and racial minorities to victory. Of course, that did not prove the point. And Trumpism, and this raises a question in terms of demographics, is Trumpism the last gasp of a particular populist form of white American politics? Right? Can the needle be thread in the consistently browning of America? Or does it speak to a reconfiguration of political coalitions that one perhaps could attain political power through very narrow means? Matt has talked very brilliantly and insightfully about social media, so I don't want to draw too much on that, but again, to reinforce the point that it's unprecedented in American history, not political tribalism, but the nature that there is now technology that enables or exacerbates the siloing and the proliferation of a post-truth context. So I just want to conclude by talking just the 1 minute I have with the future of Trumpism. Just leaving it with some questions. Number one, how does one speak so-called truth to power in a post-truth age? How does one contest political power in an age in which the very contours of political discussion are up for debate, or of any issue for that matter are up to debate? I think this is one of the most significant implications of Trumpism. Secondly, the notion of how power is distributed in terms of political coalitions. In the wake of the left's loss, or the Democratic Party, more accurately, there has been a tendency, as there always is amongst the left, to place their firing squads in circles. Right? To who is to blame? Is it women? Is it white women? Is it racial minorities? Who is to blame for this catastrophe in this way? And I think this forces peoples on the left to re-examine the dynamics of power within their movements, and not just embrace certain, as I said, peoples as forms of token identity politics. And finally, Trumpism transcends Trump. The notion that this map or that these anxieties or these tensions that I've outlined would somehow disappear if Hillary Clinton was about to be inaugurated on Friday, I think is misguided. Trumpism transcends Trump, and as a verb, as a constantly evolving political philosophy, the consequences of which are going to be with us for a long time. And finally, I would inveigh against any attempts to try and normalize what has just occurred in the United States. And I mean that across partisan and across party lines. Trumpism has blown the doors off all of the conceits and the norms of the neoliberal consensus, and it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to confront that without receding into a normalization. Thank you very much.
Yeah, probably it's somewhere at the back that there's control over some of the lights. Very good.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you, Ray, Alan, thank you, class. Also, thank you, this class, but thank you, class, the center, for having me. I come from the English department, and within the English department, I teach in critical race studies, African American and Asian American literatures, and today I want to focus on ideas of narrative and Asian American identity. So my presentation is entitled Trumpism, Asian America, and Storytelling, Notes on Rejecting Nostalgia, and hopefully you can sort of infer where I'm going to go just from that title. So in one of his many essays published in the New York Times following the election of Donald Trump, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and literary critic Viet Thanh Nguyen comments, "Our presidential election wasn't strictly a political affair. It was also a matter of storytelling. Those who sought to lead our country had to persuade the people through their ability to tell a story about who we are, where we've been, and where we're going," end quote. Nguyen went on to gesture to things like implied audience, binary characterization, unreliable narrators, terms that those of us who study literature know well, before concluding that Donald Trump is, unfortunately, a great storyteller. Nguyen's analysis reflects my own understanding of Trumpism, a magical formula that I like to think about in terms of genre fiction, that is popular literature intentionally created in order to fit into a specific genre and to appeal to fans already familiar with that genre, like the detective or the romance novel. But Nguyen's writings, and there were many on the subject, strike another chord, one that I think is pretty interesting for our conversation today. And that is, how do Asian Americans experience, intervene in, and challenge an American electoral system and mainstream discussions about race when both routinely, for better or worse, ignore them? How do they interpret the stories being told when none of those stories are for them? And most importantly to my presentation today, how do Asian Americans think about the narrative of who we are, where we've been in a national context, given the ongoing legacy of exclusion-era policies, the belief that they are forever foreign, the yellow peril to white success, the accommodating pawns that can be used in the anti-Black, anti-Latinx, and anti-Indigenous beliefs and practices upon which Trumpism hinges. So UC Berkeley law professor Taeku Lee's research suggests that Asian Americans are not only the fastest growing racial group, growing 43% between 2000 and 2010, but they're also the fastest growing racial group amongst voters, particularly in what are called battleground states: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, where the Asian American population has grown by more than 80% since 2010. Similar points were made in 2012, 2008, and in earlier years, and yet little to no acknowledgement is given to this growing demographic in terms of serious campaigning for votes. It's not original to note that one of the key tactics of Trumpism storytelling is slandering, villainizing, and insulting different marginalized groups. The story being told was also not original. Make America Great Again obviously assumes that the moment of greatness is past, and that in an earlier time, when marginalized groups stayed that way, were silent and segregated and didn't disrupt the status quo, either with their protests or protests against oppression or their very existences, that this was the ideal. The propaganda and arguable Trumpism hate speech spewed at Latinx communities, Muslim people, people with disabilities, women, queer folks, makes up a long list, each comment outdoing the last. His treatment of African Americans, be it in his disdainful remarks of racist goadings at rallies, or his grotesque allusions to so-called black-on-black crime in Chicago during the debates, would be shocking, except that they weren't. Scott Nakagawa described the Trump campaign as, and I quote, marketers of bigotry, constantly testing the public consensus, and when the test came back positive, moving extreme bigotry out of the margins and into the mainstream of our political debates, end quote. Indeed, Trump appeared to be playing a not-so-secret game of bingo, where his card was made up of oppressed and marginalized and vulnerable communities that he would target either with bombastic remarks or bigoted mockery. It seems to me that the Democrats also had the same card, but they were playing a different game. For every group that Trump insulted, they devised specific rhetoric, campaigning and performing the image of care to those communities. Part of this strategy, it appears, was to counter every Trumpist story with a story of their own, one in which Democrats had a past, present, and future of inclusion, were equity-minded, were anti-racist and anti-sexist. Audiences could chart trends in Trumpist storytelling by also observing the narratives put forth by Clinton and her team. Clinton herself criticized Trump's xenophobic attacks on Latinx communities, his baiting of Muslim American Gold Star families, his racist birther theories, and his backing of people affiliated or formerly affiliated with the KKK, possibly assuming that moralizing about racism and bigotry would build a sounder voting foundation for her. The label racist was rightfully launched in both directions throughout the campaigns, with audiences left to distinguish between liberal and conservative forms. As Kristen West-Savali asks in her article in theroot.com, in how many ways can Donald Trump and Hillary Rodham Clinton scream racist and bigot at each other with the hope of ultimately terrifying black people into voting for one or the other? Amidst all of Trump's race baiting and Clinton's attempts to capitalize inversely on the race baiting, it was fascinating to witness the relative silence from both candidates, from political commentators, from journalists, and other public figures about Asian American communities, people, and voters. That's not to say that Trump ignored these groups. He mocked Chinese business people when he mimicked his deal-making with them, chanting, "We want deal," in that racist Ching Chong voice that I think we all know. At one of his rallies, he declared that he would stop immigration to the US from the Philippines. He inferred that he would make South Koreans pay up for the military presence in their country he imagined as a generous protection service, obviously forgetting why and by whom the Koreas were separated in the first place. Trump insulted many South, Southeast, and West Asian Americans with his Islamophobia, and every time he said China, and he said it in this way that was like, China? At a rally, the characterization was consistent. China is insidious, untrustworthy, and ethically inferior. Now, of course, Asian Americans are not interchangeable with Asians around the world, but given the fact that 74% of Asian Americans over the age of 18 are first generation, one can see how impactful and racist these comments might be. But these insults rarely became fodder for mainstream conversation and barely are a footnote to the long list of Trump's racist storytelling that was clearly a popular topic of conversation in the many months leading up to the election. Asian Americans received minimal attention also from the Democrats in their public conversations on race, indicating to me that Trump's insults to Asian Americans did not register or did not register as important enough. The reasoning, if I were to speculate, could be that tired old stereotype of the bottom minority that homogenizes and reduces Asian American experience in ways that ignores mass poverty, particularly in our immigrant communities, and Islamophobia faced by many different Asian American groups. But Asian Americans, and I'll also add here Asian Canadians in case you were wondering, are over being imagined as honorary whites, not just because it ignores very real struggles and suggests some kind of white assimilative ideal, but also because it harms Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people of color while serving as alibi for ignoring Asian American complaints of racism and oppression. So even though Asian Americans were relatively ignored by both parties throughout the campaigns, it was fascinating to witness the ways that individuals and groups intervened, though uninvited, in conversations being had about race in the US. They responded to the storytelling by most poignantly calling out the Make America Great Again narrative for what it really was. A white supremacist alibi that trafficked in nostalgia for a time when segregation kept people of color from getting too uppity, when immigration borders could be closed based on national origin, when human beings could be owned. I hasten to add that folks who are paying attention know that these atrocities have not disappeared, but have been simply reworked into other formats, like the prison industrial complex, like the always changing terminologies and requirements surrounding documentation. But regardless, Asian Americans inserted their voices by revealing the true sentiments and risks of Trumpism storytelling. They created campaigns against xenophobia, Trump and his supporters espoused, telling their own stories about family sufferings during the years of Chinese exclusion, which was in effect until 1943, and the palpable racism and xenophobia experienced after events like the war in Vietnam and 9/11. They reached out to Latinx communities in solidarity. Most visibly, Asian Americans expressed horror at the Trumpist idea of Muslim registry and internment. Japanese Americans were amongst the most vocal in pointing out similarities of his proposed plans to the deportation and internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans during and after the Second World War. The APA Law Students Association of Yale notes, and I quote, "The Asian American community has come together to reject Trumpism precisely because this is not the first time we've seen these dangerous ideas take root in America. Indeed, our country's now denounced history of codified discrimination against Asian Americans offers a clear rejoinder to Trump's nativist policy prescriptions today." And so, as Jeremy Peters points out, despite the fact that, on paper at least, Asian Americans seem like perfect Republicans, many are small business owners, their communities tend to be more culturally conservative, and a lot of them, having fled oppressive communist governments, found comfort in the Republican Party's aggressive anti-communist policies. Asian Americans heavily rejected Trumpism, both throughout the campaign and when it came time to vote. And I think Paul showed a graph. What do you call it, social scientist? A graph? It's something like that.
Numbers and colors.
I'd like to conclude my presentation by asking you all to think about what narratives of nostalgia, like Make America Great Again, really mean, because they're all over, even subtly in liberal forms. I imagine that many of us here are ideologically on a similar page. Racism, bad. Sexism, bad. Ableism, bad. Homophobia, transphobia, bad, etc., right? However, when you encounter mainstream narratives of nostalgia, and right now I'm thinking a lot about that La La Land film, because everyone's getting all over that. Consider not just who benefits and who is excluded from those narratives, but also think about why those exclusions exist and who is imagining those moments as great, as a golden age. Think about segregation, xenophobia, settler colonial genocide, and all of the other racist contexts that make American and Canadian national nostalgia, as well as contemporary celebration, I'll add, a white privilege. I'll leave you with the words of Phil Yu, who runs the blog Angry Asian Man. If you don't know it, check it out. In response to an invitation for creative writers to author stories about time travel, Yu remarks that national nostalgia is a white privilege. Let's face it, he says, time travel is for white people.
Okay, whoever's in charge of the lights, would they bring them up, please? Just to say, we do have a few minutes, so I've asked the three speakers to remain at the front, and we can entertain some questions before we adjourn. So, the floor is open for questions. Yes, Jane.
I think my question's primarily for Paul, but go ahead, whoever would like to answer. I'm just wondering if you could just parse out very quickly fascism as an antecedent to Trumpism, and it seems to me that when Arendt talks about an alternative truth that was part of the origins of totalitarianism, we see a lot of parallels today.
You mean in the American context?
In
Fascism in the American
Yeah,
context?
I mean, is Trumpism a parallel? What are the ongoing parallels with fascism?
Well, if you look at prior fascistic movements, whether it be the American Firsters of the early 20th century, people such as Charles Lindbergh and the like, they very much share these strains that we see in Trumpism and anti-cosmopolitanism. We see enthrall to authoritarianism, not just in one's, in the medium through which one expresses himself, but also with who one allies himself with. So Trump's very bizarre but ongoing connections to people such as Vladimir Putin in this way, and then idealization of strength, strength in whatever form, but strength as being the main imperative of political discourse. So in the American context, it's largely this anti-cosmopolitan. It's sort of sprinkled with, I said, sort of an anti-corporate economic egalitarianism, but absent the social welfare nets that accompany that in a leftist populist context. So Trumpism, if you draw the sort of genealogies in that way, does share those strains, I would say, yes.
Either the other. Okay, all right. Another question? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Colin Hamlin. I'm a medical student at the University of Manitoba, and I host a radio station here. I guess my main comment would come down to we're having a conversation about politics, about the world, and one disappointment that I would have is how we talked about echo chambers, and it does seem to me that, I mean, first of all, in terms of identity politics, we have a black man, an Asian woman, and a white man. I see a lot of skin color diversity, but I don't see a lot of intellectual diversity here. And if there's any context, forget the media or even on the street, I think the academia should be the place where we challenge our opinions and think about the positive, rich theoretical arguments. Conservatism has a rich theoretical academic tradition, and I'm not hearing that being represented here. So I just think in terms of how we think, I would like to see more of this diversity. I think the best thing we can do when we disagree with other people, I mean, frankly, we put up that map, most of the country doesn't believe you guys. Well, there's this big divide, and I think it's onus upon us as academics to do our part to be especially mature about this and do everything but inflammatory label everyone else as, oh, questioning their motives. No, they have a positive moral argument that I think we should face head on. So if you guys have anything to say to that,
Let's just say in defense, we've only been at it for 40 minutes. All right, anyone
yeah,
want
but I
to
will say that.
If I may add, just as a procedural notes, all of the more conservative speakers that we invited politely declined our invitation.
Well, my sense is on campus, it's not because you have conservative people like Ann Coulter being, and I'm not like an Ann Coulter fan or anything, I think she's not my favorite at all, but you definitely have a move to suppress anyone basically who disagrees. So I think that point doesn't hold up.
It's a good point. Any other question? Yes, sir. Sir.
I wonder if any of you see Trumpism coming to Canada, say, for the next election.
Well, I mean, my spontaneous response is that, well, this morning we had the announcement from Mr. Wonderful himself, Governor Lawrie, who is, the shark among sharks, who's thrown he's thrown into the race. So I'm kind of curious to see how that plays out. That's a media personality himself, both on the Shark Tank and as a commentator on the Lang and O'Leary report, how that kind of reality TV public persona mixed with a kind of rightward chauvinism, the kind that we see with a figure like Donald Trump, how that kind of plays out in the Canadian context.
Okay. Yes, sir. At the back. Yeah. Yes.
My name is Joel Kettner. I was a medical student. I'm a medical doctor. I don't know why there's so much medical interest in this topic, but I am going to use that as a little bit of a metaphor because, and this is not sophisticated language, we have a brain, and we have a heart, we have a stomach. The reason I'm saying that is, what is the role of emotion in that election? What was the role of emotion in that election? And in increasingly in elections today in the so-called Western democratic countries, rather than the intellectual analysis, it's that gut, it's that hard emotional reaction, which Trump was clearly able to tap into and Clinton was not. And so where is the role of that in understanding what has happened and what could happen in the future?
I mean, I think that the fact that all three of us talked about nostalgia, which evokes very real emotions for a lot of people, I think that we see indeed Donald Trump was an excellent storyteller and an excellent affective storyteller in that particular way. I also think, as Paul mentioned, the idea of grief and fear and anxiety were emotions that were tapped into for sure, which is why maybe to the last question, I can see that I can maybe not anticipate, but I could imagine how in a Canadian context, someone who could tap into those same affective leanings could succeed.
And I think it's a fantastic question, and thank you for your question, but I think what Trumpism has also done is it's laid bare the conceit of liberal, and I use small l liberal political ideology, that politics has always been about emotion and emotive nature. I mean, Donald Trump is the id of the American political system, writ large. And he's thrown that open in that way. So it's an absolutely valid point, I take your point, but I don't believe, speaking as a historian, that it's ever been about again, this liberal conceit that it's about reasoned, critical, empirical debate. It is about the politics of personality. And Donald Trump is the living, breathing embodiment of that.
If I can just add to that quickly from a media perspective, again, when you think about the kind of, I mentioned, well, first thing, one of the last points I made was about Trump's ability to kind of tap into, to create a story, a way of what I call cognitive mapping, to help people explain their situation in their context. So I think what Jenny's talking about in terms of narrative and storytelling is one way that you do that. You can't have any storytelling without an affective dimension. That's the pathos that kind of speaks to the people. But just to add to what Paul was saying, from a media perspective, even somebody like Chomsky and that kind of critique of media, I'm kind of skeptical of, because the whole sort of cause behind that is this notion that there's this system of filtration in the media, whether it's the ownership of the media, whether it's advertising, whether it's other kind of groups that give criticism that we don't want to present these ideas. The Chomsky idea is that if only we had a system of media where the facts, the truth, the logical reasoning could be presented, then the people would act accordingly. I think that the problem with thinking of that is that many of us are aware of the facts, that just simply presenting the logical explanation today isn't enough, because there's sort of this cynical resignation that there is no alternative, going back to the Thatcher argument. So one of the things that I think the left has failed on that end is presenting a viable, not just logical alternative, but also an affective alternative, a way of storytelling that can do the kind of thing that we saw with Trumpism, but that really brings things back to some of the underlying political economic causes of people's discontent in the world today.
And okay, so sorry, I just want to, we didn't address your point. It's a valid point that you make about the diversity of thought. But, and that was one of the Achilles heels of the left, of the progressive left particularly, in not just this electoral cycle, but other electoral cycles, of this ability, or this inability to talk directly or understand directly people with contrary opinions. And so I take your point. There's a wonderful quote, it's supposed to be apocryphal, but Pauline Kael, the New Yorker film critic in the 1970s, says, "I don't understand how Richard Nixon won. Nobody I know voted for him." Which is to, you know, this insularity of the fact in her small theater circle in New York, why would any Nixon wins, right, every state save but two in 1972, an absolute landslide. So I take your point in not, and also you made the point of taking people seriously, but that also raises uncomfortable truths. That also raises uncomfortable truth. Not accusing people of what they're saying is bad. It's even worse to say what you're saying is not really what you're saying. But then also not being able to be confronted with the fact that things that Jenny meant, things such as white privilege, things such as like, those could be rational imperatives. Those could be, people could come to rational conclusions about that. And that's very troubling. And it forces us to think about that. So I take your point. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take one more question. I recognize you. You had your hand up, unless you wanted to wait.
Yeah, sorry, I'll try to collect my thoughts again, but.
Well, I tell you what, I'll recognize you instead, because you have your thoughts together.
Okay, yeah. So one of the speakers said that, Trumpism is here to stay with us for a long time. So my question is, for some of us who resent or the ideologies of Donald Trump, how, as global citizens, how can we come together, on what platform do we have to organize or do something about this movement of Trumpism?
Well, again, my sort of spontaneous response to that is I think that there are already mobilizations, movements that are happening on the ground. I think we have to look at recent history as well. I think that if you look at something like, although in some ways you can think of them as failures, a movement like the Occupy Wall Street movement I think was very successful in changing the very language that we use to talk about inequality in the world, the 1% and the 99%. That has that affective level of encouraging people to think about inequality in other new ways. I think another thing that, one of the reasons why I found a figure like Bernie Sanders appealing was because he's broken through this stigma again, with the term socialism. When we're talking about alternatives to the capitalist realism of our time, one of the things that people are looking for is alternative narratives, alternative language that we can use to make sense of our situation. And I think breaking through that stigma, now we can say socialism. If you look at statistics again today, young people, the younger generation, are much more, who don't have that memory of the Cold War period, are much more open to thinking about alternatives to capitalism and to liberalism, liberal capitalism in that way. So for me, that's something as a way forward to try to think about what to do in the wake of this success of a Trumpism.
All right, can I just then wind things up and recognize my colleague, Ray Silvius, as someone they've also helped organize this very much. And if I can say if I can say something in conclusion, it is, this is the kind of event that a university should be for. So thank you very much for coming, and